Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is John Diamond. I'm the president of the University of Maine Alumni Association. We're an independent organization of 110,000 Black Bear alumni, and we have members living in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and in more than 100 countries. So we are a global organization. Today, we're collaborating with UMaine's School of Policy and International Affairs to bring you this webinar entitled American Diplomacy in Turbulent Times. This is another in a series of webinars on current events that we've been doing. Our panelists today are three distinguished Black Bear alumni with extensive experience in diplomacy and world affairs. Their profiles were included in the webinar invitation we sent to you, but so to save time, I won't go into a great deal about their backgrounds, but I do want to tell you a little bit about them before we get started. In alphabetical order, our panelists are retired U.S. Ambassador Ann Hall. She's a member of the class of 1981. And among her many diplomatic positions and accomplishments, Ambassador Hall served as U.S. Ambassador to Lithuania from 2016 until 2019. And prior to that, from 2014 to 2016, she served as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs. And prior to that, she was Director of the Office of Central European Affairs. She currently lives in Blue Hill, Maine. Our second panelist is retired Admiral Gregory Johnson. Admiral Johnson is a member of UMaine's class of 1968. He had a 36-year naval career, and that included key leadership roles for the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. His final 3 years of military service were spent as commander of U.S. naval forces in Europe and Africa, and as commander-in-chief of Allied forces in Southern Europe. He currently resides in Cundies Harbor, Maine. And our third panelist is retired U.S. Ambassador Pamela Murphy White. Ambassador White is a 1971 graduate of UMaine. She served as the U.S. Ambassador to the Gambia from 2010 until 2012, and followed that with 3 years as U.S. Ambassador to Haiti. Prior to her appointment as ambassador, Ambassador White worked for the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. She started that in 1978 and served in Senegal, Haiti, Egypt, and South Africa. She now lives on Orr's Island, not too far from Admiral Johnson. And moderating today's discussion is another person with extensive credentials in world affairs, and that's retired Navy Captain Jim Settley. He currently serves as the director of UMaine's School of Policy and International Affairs, and his career has included senior positions at the Pentagon and with NATO and many other important positions in public service. Before I turn the screen over to Captain Settley, I'd like to just go over the Q&A part of the program that will be following today, and that Q&A section will occur a little later in the webinar. If you have any questions for one or more of the panelists, you can submit them at any time, and here's how you do it. You go to the bottom of your Zoom screen, and right in the middle, you'll see a little comic strip speech bubble. That's the chat button. So to submit a question, just click on that bubble, type in your question, and hit enter or return on your keyboard. That'll submit the question. And we'll get to those questions later in the program, and we'll cover as many of them in the hour and a half that we have available today. We are recording this session, so it'll be made available online later. And so if you want to watch it again or refer to other folks, you'll have the ability to do so. So with that, let's get started. Captain Settley, the rudder is all yours.
Yeah, my illustrious John, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting myself to moderate this incredible panel, this amazing panel, which have had incredible global experience and foreign policy experience, both in State Department and Department of Defense, and to hear some different perspectives from our panelists. I'm going to ask our panelists in the order of as they were introduced. First, Ambassador Hall, and then Admiral Johnson, and then Ambassador White. Just take a few minutes to open up and provide a little background or a little perspective on why they are here today, and certainly a little perspective and context on the subject of diplomacy in turbulent times. And so we'll kick it over to Ambassador Hall. Ma'am, you first.
Oh, thanks, Jim. Well, this is an apt time and an apt title, I think, because certainly the world is changing, and this is a pivotal moment where I believe the potential is there for a big adjustment of alignments in global policies, like we have seen in the past, but probably not for a few years. This is, I believe, in a time of enormous opportunity for the United States if we can take advantage of it. We've done so in the past, and I believe we will again, but this has yet to play out. So I think we're going to have an opportunity to talk about some rather overarching topics today. So I'm going to start a little bit more narrowly. Given my background, I spent some time in China, thought I'd stay in Asia most of my career. At one point spoke pretty good Chinese. And then in 2001 was pulled in to the Office of Nordic and Baltic Affairs, where we were working to support the aspirations of the Baltics people to join both NATO and the European Union. Even though we're not EU member states, we've always supported those countries of Europe that wanted to join in so doing. So there's a quotation that dates from 2002 that is near and dear to the hearts of anybody in the Baltics, and they can all quote it. And it's quite apropos for today. When George Bush visited Vilnius in November of 2002 to welcome NATO's decision to invite the Baltics to join the NATO alliance, he said, and I quote, "Anyone who would choose Lithuania as an enemy has also made an enemy of the United States of America." And that quotation is now enshrined in a plaque on the town hall in Vilnius. But he went on to say something that resonates quite perhaps more deeply than we thought it would today. He said, "In the face of aggression, the brave people of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia will never again stand alone. You have known cruel oppression and withstood it. You have been held captive by an empire and you outlived it. And because you have paid its cost, you know the value of human freedom." And unquote. I spent, after serving in the Office of Nordic and Baltic Affairs, much of my career in Eastern Europe, something I never imagined doing, in Poland and then on to Lithuania and Director for Central Europe. And it's hard, honestly, to overstate the desire that people in sort of the new NATO member states have felt and expressed over the last 30 years to be a part of the Western European alliances, and the way they look at the United States. Certainly, we're not infallible, but they really see us as they certainly see us as their guarantor of security within NATO. And I think as we've seen this current war in Ukraine play out, you can see why they've had doubts about Germany and France, although certainly Germany has made tremendous changes in its defense policy of late, which is very welcome. But we are their guarantor of power, and we are all that represents a reality of freedom to them. And we're the model that they look to. And I think that's something that can't be forgotten when you look at the relationships, the dynamics within both NATO and the European Union. Since those new countries have joined those alliances, they've perhaps created some headaches for some of the older members. I remember at one point when France told Poland that Poland needed to sort of know its place in the EU. But it's also created, I think, certainly many people would argue, a great deal of vitality within those organizations. And the kind of spirit and the kind of willingness to pay a price for freedom that I have felt from knowing people in that part of the world is what we're seeing play out in Ukraine today. And to the people of the Baltics, in Poland, I dare say Romania, I've spent some time there, what we're seeing in Ukraine is not a surprise. It's not a surprise that Putin attacked, or, well, he attacked 8 years ago, but that he went further. But also the will of the Ukrainian military and people more broadly to fight the Russians and to defend what they have gained is also not a surprise. And so I think I just wanted to set that stage as we talk today about where we are in the future, the ascendancy of perhaps autocratic regimes, the weaknesses of the West, which are there, but where we'll end up. Certainly, people in the Baltics, and I'm generalizing, but it's quite true. They have a lot of faith still in democracy. There are some challenges. Certainly, there've been some challenges to democracy in Poland, but I think most people there would say that that in the end will prevail. So with that, I'll leave it and turn back to Jim.
Thank you, ma'am. Appreciate that. Admiral Johnson.
Yes, thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure and honor to be part of this group talking about American diplomacy. I feel very much slightly out of place, surrounded by two ambassadors. And I would be the first to tell you that the first and the lead organization in diplomacy and advocating and developing U.S. national security policy is the State Department. And the Department of Defense, the West Bank of the Potomac, as opposed to the East Bank of the Potomac, is a secondary or subordinate to the State Department. And I know we'll talk about it later in budgets and what have you, but I think that most of the people who come from my side of the Potomac would agree with that. And it's always been an honor and a privilege to work with the professionals in the Foreign Service and our various diplomatic missions around the world. I was a commander in Europe or wherever, whenever we visited any country. First of all, we always got permission from the chief of mission in whatever country we were visiting. And the very first call you made was on the chief of mission. And any of the work that we did short of war, when you have an actual AOR or a joint operating area designated by the Department of Defense, by the president, the person in charge is the ambassador. So I don't know if people fully appreciate that, but that is the way it is, and everybody honors that, and it works much better that way. I come to this, like Jim said, I spent 36 years, or I guess it was John that said, in the Navy. And fortunately, a good deal of that part of that time was spent in policy. And I worked with some superb practitioners of that art, geostrategic strategy, developing geostrategic policy for the United States and various alliances that we operated with. And I think I had role models that served me well and served our nation with great distinction. And particularly General Powell, who I served with first, and then the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Dr. John Hamre, who's still very active as the Executive Director, President, CEO of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And of course, Secretary Cohen, who many of you probably had the good fortune of listening to a week ago Monday, along with General Mattis and Kyle Carpenter. It was a great day, a wonderful day. And all three of them are elegant and very successful practitioners of the art of diplomacy. And so it was a great learning experience to serve with them during the time that I was working in policy. I think I'll leave the rest of it to the question and answers, but I do want to say kind of background that I do think that this is a hinge point in history. It's certainly, I think, one of the most, if not the most critical moment in the post-World War II history of our country, and in fact, history of the world. So much depends on the outcome of this particular disaster that's unfolding in Ukraine. And, you know, I believe that the reason I served in the military, I was in the business of peace and providing a peaceful environment so freedom, democracy can flourish. And if any corner of the world, there's a wind blowing that allows that flame to quiver a little bit, it not only impacts that particular spot where it's taking place, but it casts a shadow, creates wind and turbulence in every other corner of the world where freedom and democracy do prevail. And I think by every measure, certainly in all the measures that Freedom House uses in their annual appraisal of the arc of democracy, they find it in decline at this point. And sadly, certainly Mr. Putin, but I think other autocratic leaders in the world firmly believe that democracy is in decline. that we're having a difficult time governing ourselves, let alone serving as a model for others, and that we are in a period of moral decline. And of course, we all know that any significant world power, and I don't want to use the word empire, but they've all come and gone. And so let's hope it's not our time to be in decline, and we still have the wherewithal to come back and fight these horrible forces of oppression that are running amok in the world today. And I think with that, I'll turn it back over to Jim.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And I appreciate the scene setting from our first two panelists. And I know that Pam's going to continue with that scene setting. Ambassador White, over to you.
Hey, thanks, Jim. Thanks everyone for coming and listening to us today. I'm a little different trajectory to my career. I started out my overseas career as a Peace Corps volunteer in a little tiny village in Cameroon in West Africa, and learned a great deal about what people felt about the United States of America on a one-on-one basis. Everybody in my village only knew 3 Americans: John Wayne, Muhammad Ali, and JFK. And I think that it sort of spoke to what we were doing with our propaganda, which is not a negative term. I think it's a positive term in many ways at that point that was very, very strong throughout Africa during the Cold War, and how positive Americans were viewed. And that view of Americans continued when I joined USAID. So I started out with Peace Corps and then moved to USAID for decades, where I served in numerous countries and felt very closely the respect that the people in those countries where I worked felt for the United States of America. The United States of America was the beacon. It was the most respected nation on earth. It was a place where everyone looked to for rights, human rights, the king, the queen of human rights around the world. And I think that was extraordinarily important, and it was extraordinarily gratifying to me to be a part of spreading American values around the world. And then when I was ambassador twice, you're a little more at the state-to-state relationship when you're an ambassador than you are with USAID, which is more people to people, but you still get a sense of where people are coming from and how the voice of America impacts their lives. And I think that has continued today. Although when I recently saw the vote in the UN about whether Russia should continue being a part of the Human Rights Council of the UN, and the vote was clearly 93 nations agreed that Russia should be kicked out of the Human Rights Council, but 58 countries abstained. And some of those countries that abstained had long, long ties with the United States of America: India, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, South Africa. Not only had they long ties with the United States of America, but they had long, very positive ties with the United States of America. And there were 58 countries in all that abstained that I felt should, maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, definitely would have been in the column with the United States of America, voting to not just to abstain, but to make sure that Russia was not any longer part of the council. I thought it was important to note how those countries had reacted to the vote. So I think the United States, I agree totally with the first two in Grog that we are at a pivotal point in our country's history. I do believe that we have lost some of the power of spreading the word around the world of how great a nation we really are. I think that there's several reasons for that, which we'll get to, I'm sure, over the course of the next hour. But I think we have to be very careful on how we approach the world and how we use every tool open to us to make sure that the world still stands for freedom of speech, freedom of religion, women's rights, like we have been doing for the past decades. So I'm looking forward to the discussion and hope that we get to talk about some tough issues and have some, not full answers, but at least partial answers. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much, and appreciate the scene setting by all three of you. It has certainly set the stage. And I want to start with a point that each of you made in a different context, and that's the U.S. place in the global world. And so the question that we've heard addressed a couple different ways, and I know that Secretary Cohen addressed it last week or talks about it, and it's something that's near and dear to all of our hearts, is the lack of civility in our own country. So the question is, this will go to you, Admiral Johnson, first. Does the lack of civility in our own country impact our relationships with other countries? And does it impact our ability to conduct sound foreign policy? So what's going on domestically? How does that impact us globally? And if it's negative, how do we change the trajectory?
Thanks, Jim, for that question. And I think the answer is clearly yes. It has a huge impact. In fact, Pam was mentioning when she talked about our public affairs, public policy programs that we had during the Cold War. You know, they knew about John Glenn, John Wayne, and Muhammad Ali, even in the most remote part of Cameroon. And we've lost that art, but others, including, of course, Mr. Putin and Russia, are masters at it. They're very good at it, and social media and what have you help them spread this far and wide. I've been getting bots and what have you, different things from all over the place. I think people of my ilk, I'm constantly getting, my contacts list looked at and what have you, and the thinking that probably I still have connections with people in the Pentagon and what have you, and sending all kinds of information. It's amazing what's out there. And, when you do one click and then in artificial intelligence, you just get flooded with this information. So someone who wants to use it and use it in a negative way, like Russia and what have you, it's very easy for them. And so the things that aren't so good about our country right now, the lack of civility, the lack of mutual respect, a Congress that has a very, very difficult time trying to get any legislation passed, other than sort of working their hardest to make sure that the other opposite party doesn't get anything significant accomplished. Although I was glad to see the vote on support for Ukraine, everybody with the unanimous vote, but that's hard to come by. So this gets played out all over the world, and they know a lot more about the things that we can't do. They know a lot more about racial issues, about the lack of civility, false news, and all of that. And so if we try to hold ourselves up as a beacon, as a model to emulate and what have you, it's just harder to sell. And so we have to be mindful of that. And I think it's, like your parents taught you when you were a child. I mean, you can't just say one thing and do something else. You sort of have to walk the walk if you're going to talk the talk. And so I think that we have to set a better example ourselves. And furthermore, then being able to come together in times of crisis and to portray a unified front going forward, this all has a huge impact. And I think if those of you who are with Secretary Cohen and Secretary Mattis last Monday, Secretary Cohen was truly one of the most accomplished diplomats that I ever served with and was around, and was incredibly effective, and brought a measured tone and very credible. And but we had a background then in the United States. It was a time under the euphoria of the end of the Cold War, and it was a time when the juxtaposition between idealism in American foreign policy and realpolitik, where the idealistic side of us was in the fore and was carrying a strong message at that time. Not so much since we got involved in Iraq and Afghanistan and what have you. And so I think we need to be mindful of that and start thinking about repairing our image if we're going to carry the day with the autocratic rulers who seem to be able to get things done more quickly and what have you. And that's a strong message to societies that are struggling. So there's an awful lot of people sitting on the fence today. India, China for that matter, Turkey, Nigeria, Brazil, South Africa, you name it, and they're all watching this very, very carefully. And so if the flame of freedom and democracy goes out in Ukraine, and shall we say the West loses this particular skirmish that's going on, I think it'll have incredibly negative impact. So this is very, very important. And unfortunately, we've been asleep at the switch for the last 20 years and allowed the circumstances for this to happen. And so we've lost our ability to deter. We're being deterred. We've lost escalation dominance in the game of deterrence and lost the initiative. And so to gain those things back, it's going to take quite a transformation. And we have a very short time to come up with the wherewithal to help Ukraine in meaningful ways as the nature of this war switches from one in a forested area that was ill-conceived to a strategy that's now in more open ground with heavy armor and in areas that the Russian dominance is quite superior to the actual material things that the Ukrainian military has. Their fighting spirit, though, is another matter. And it may truly be that in all respects, despite all the much heavier artillery, armor, and what have you that the Russians have, that in fact, they are a Potemkin military. But if we win, it's going to be because of that and the incredible courage displayed by the Ukrainians and not the stuff that we did to maybe help this from happening in the first place over the last 20, 25 years.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Ambassador Hall or Ambassador White, anything to add?
Just quickly, I think that the view that the world is now having in the United States, which you know, the great propaganda machines coming out of China and Russia exploit terribly, but just the January 6th horror show is being shown over and over and over again. This is American democracy today. You can't have America looking so brutally violent and almost anti-democratic around the world without paying a huge price. I think our standing has been diminished over the last decade, and we need desperately to try to regain it. And it's going to take a lot of hard work, and it's going to take a lot of money, but we're way behind the 8 ball on this one.
Thank you. Ambassador Hall.
No, I think they've covered it well. I think I have things I can cover in other places.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Well, I was going to go to a different question, but your answers have actually led to perhaps a question about the ascendancy, perceived ascendancy of autocracies and the decline of democracy, global democracy. So Seth Singleton, whom we all know, and some folks that are listening know, his class is, of SPIA students right now is listening in. They and so many others are interested in the changing global dynamic with respects to governments. So many say that the arc of autocratic forms of government is ascending and democratic governments are in decline and seemingly unable to govern themselves, let alone serve as a model for others to emulate. Do you believe this? And how will this transform U.S. foreign policy? So the rise of autocracies globally, perhaps the decline of democracies. And is that in fact what you believe? And then how does that inform our U.S. foreign policy? And I'll kick it over to Ambassador Hall first.
Well, gosh, so many places I could go with this. You know, I think certainly there are going to be countries that are going to be in the process of kind of recalibrating perhaps their alignments, if not their alliances. You know, I mean, in Western Europe, certainly some of the more traditional, the older members of the European Union, and then some who are not. And then, of course, you were looking at Finland and Sweden. I mean, they're certainly closer to buying the argument of their Eastern European neighbors that Russia can't be trusted, and that therefore we can't, you know, work with Russia as we hoped we could. They're closer to certainly believing that argument than they ever have been before. I would say that our Pacific allies undoubtedly are watching this and are recalculating some of their relationships with Russia. I mean, Russia India has not yet. India has always seen Russia as a counterbalance to China, and that I think is probably great disappointment to our embassy in India, but we haven't been able to make any headway at all with India. But let's look at Mexico as an example. Mexico has long purchased military equipment from Russia. Well, they're not going to be able, because of the sanctions, they're not going to be able to get the parts they need, the spare parts they need for some of that equipment. Are they going to have to rethink what they've been doing? Looking at China, more broadly, China right now is amplifying terribly Russian propaganda, and this is no different than what China did. Well, it's to a greater degree, but it's absolutely what China did during the war in Yugoslavia. I was in China at the time, and they were very pro-Serbia. The Chinese population, even then, in those early days of the internet, only saw sort of the pro-Serbia position. And once again, they're amplifying the Russian propaganda. There's in Chinese media, there are pictures of U.S. flags alongside Nazi flags. Obviously, the people aren't getting the message that. Anyway, that gets obviously seems a little muddy to me. But anyway, they're doing that. I've seen that. They're spreading the Russian allegations of U.S. Chemical and biological weapons in Ukraine, and all of this. But I would say that I suspect that there are areas in the Pacific, certainly Pacific Islands, Africa, countries in Africa who've already had some difficult experience with China over the last few years that are watching this. And I think that we'll see how this plays out, but I think there's a risk that China's going to disgrace itself by hitching itself to the wrong wagon. China is one last example in the process of signing an agreement with the Solomon Islands. China has always worked as you get further and further away from China itself in the South China Sea. Their goal thus far has been economic influence, political influence, relatively benign, but obviously there's always a quid pro quo. But they're increasingly seeking, military strategic positions in areas that, as their capability improves, and I won't get into Greg's lane because he knows more about this than I do, but as their military capabilities improve, and we have to start to think about how close we can operate to China, they're looking further and further away. And so, they're looking at signing an agreement with Solomon Islands would give them very significant presence there. There are undersea communications cables there that they're likely interested in. Of course, fishing, possibility of a base for their fleet. I would suspect that, Solomon Islands is probably looking at, what's happening and the positions China is taking, and perhaps it may give them a bit of pause. So I would simply say that I think that there's reason to be concerned about whether or not we take advantage of all that is happening right now. But certainly in this state of flux, there is a lot of opportunity for us, and if we can talk at some point perhaps about what our limitations have been. I will say simply, even in places like Europe, which is wealthy compared to most of the world, the Chinese deep pockets with no strings, certainly no good governance conditions, is too attractive for many countries to resist. You add to that Russian deep pockets, especially in the Balkans, and their corruptive influences, and that is that poses quite a challenge for us, even in that part of the world. Not much less in Africa and in Latin America. We don't have the budget we need to counter what these countries are doing. We don't have the public diplomacy power that we used to have to counter this. So these are areas in which we've been asleep for 20 years. The last administration very wisely retooled the Overseas Private Investment Corporation into something called the Development Finance Corporation. One of the express purposes of that was to give our business more financing available to counter Chinese investment in a lot of parts of the world. But the per capita income cap on eligibility for that money means that we can't use it, for example, in the Baltics or some of the Central European countries, where Russia and China are both very actively targeting. And so we've made, I think there's an awareness certainly in Washington of the challenges that we're facing. But going back to our congressional paralysis, the question is going to be, are we going to be able to muster the focus that we need to actually take steps to address it?
Thank you, ma'am. Admiral Johnson or Ambassador White, any thoughts or comments to add on the rise of autocracy, the decline of democracy, and maybe Admiral Johnson from a DoD perspective in the impacts there?
No, but I agree with that trend line currently, and you take it in terms of numbers of people, China and India, both of them, India becoming rapidly more autocratic and a singular party. And that's 40% of the world's population right there. And so I think it's going to have a huge impact. And Pam mentioned January 6th. It's awfully hard with the kind of stalemate we have in Congress now, and then events like that taking place in our country, which just feeds those who want to tarnish the image of America. I still think, we're still in the process of forming a more perfect union, but I think we do it better than any other country in the world. And we have a 246-year legacy that's quite remarkable. But democracy is difficult. You need to labor in that vineyard every single day and take care of it. And it's precious and it's a dear thing. And I think we've kind of forgotten that. And so we need to pay attention to it. And I'm hopeful that we'll have moderate voices across the political spectrum in America and other like-minded nations where we can start regaining kind of the ascending arc that we had at the end of the Cold War and up through, I would say, about 2010. And then for a multitude of reasons, that image became more and more tarnished. And Russia became stronger, China became stronger, more self-confident, and they've kind of turned the tables a little bit. It is a real live force out there, and the one that we do not do a very good job of articulating and defending ourselves. And again, defending ourselves, that begins at home, like your parents try to teach you. You got to kind of walk the walk that you talk. And so it's very hard to make that case when we've got things that we need to tend to back in our own pasture.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I'm going to address this next question to the ambassadors. Ambassador White, we'll start with you. And it's a great follow-on to where Admiral Johnson was just leaving, and that is, there needs to be a turnaround. We're at a critical point in our foreign policy, in our world. And so I know that's something I've heard through time, and I wonder how we change this trajectory. But do today's diplomats have the tools they need to perform at the highest levels? And if they don't, what would be the tools that you would like to see our diplomatic corps have moving forward? And this is, one of the things that I always look for when we do these kind of talks, or you listen in on a talk, is what can, as a listener, what can I do to help change the trajectory? What can I do to help make a difference? I'm some listener someplace, and I'm listening to these amazing people. And I know that I get asked by our congressional delegation to write letters from time to time about changing budgets, increasing budgets, and then enough people speak up that can be impactful. And I know that this is an area where people can write congressional delegations, because I think you're going to go where we need some help. So do our diplomats today have the tools that they need to perform at the best levels? And if they don't, what do they need?
I categorically say no, they don't. They need more money in order to compete with what the Russians and especially the Chinese are doing. Especially my area of expertise is Africa. And the Chinese are everywhere in Africa. When I first started in Africa in the 70s, no one even ever heard or saw a Chinese anywhere. And the United States of America was pretty much everywhere. It was the Cold War. And we had, comparatively speaking, wonderful programs. Especially we had huge, what we call participant training programs, and we sent hundreds and hundreds of Africans to the United States to our universities. where not only did they get trained to be great technocrats and scientists and teachers, but they also became American diplomats. They went back to Africa and they sang the praises of our country. No one was greater at spreading the word of how great democracy was and how great the United States of America was, and the people that came to the United States and actually could observe how we operated here. A hugely successful program, almost unheard of today. But I also think that our inability to spread our message is critically important. Unfortunately, in 1998, 1997, 1998, Jesse Helms decided that both USAID and United States Information Service should be all consolidated under the State Department. And thanks to many strong voices, Brian Atwood included, but many others, it was decided in the end that USAID would not be subsumed under State Department. But unfortunately, the great United States Information Service agency was subsumed under State Department, which I believe is one of the greatest mistakes we have made. It was a $2 billion program. It had 10,000 employees almost. Half of them were professional journalists. They were not foreign service officers. They were professional journalists that knew how to shape our world overseas. We were speaking in 70 or 80 languages. We were in 150 countries. All of that has gone down to the budget's half its size. The staffing is a quarter of the size. Our ability to promote the values of the United States of America has significantly diminished over time, and it is our own fault that we can't seem to move countries in the right direction and head them towards democracy versus autocracies, because they are the ones that are getting all the money. Where our machine dried up, believe me, the Russian machine and the Chinese machine has gained millions of dollars, millions of viewers around the world. And so the word about how wonderful it is that socialism and everyone should be treated equally and everyone has equal access to riches, et cetera, is far outbeating our messaging around the world. And I think this has got to be looked at and much more has to go into it. I also believe that the budget given to development agencies is totally inadequate. The Chinese, although they've been criticized that they bring their own workers and what they do is kind of shoddy, and et cetera, but the fact of the matter is all across at least Africa and probably the world, they're building roads, they're building hospitals, they're building a good, schools, and they don't say to a country, well, you have to think like we do, or we don't want you doing this politically, or you have to do that. They just say, we're coming into your country to help, and you tell us what it is you need. And so in countries that have these autocratic leaders, they're very welcomed, and they can point to, look at that road, look at that school. Why wouldn't we be friends with the Chinese or the Russians? And I think we need to devote a heck of a lot more money to development and to our public relations than we have in the past. Immediately.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Ambassador Hall. Oh, muted.
Thanks. No, I completely agree with everything that was just said. I would also add a couple of things. When Secretary Powell served as Secretary of State, and he focused on the desperate need we had for more personnel, and he always said that one of the first things he noticed is that the State Department didn't have, I think, what he called afloat, enough people so that you could have a portion of your employees in training at any one time, a portion sort of in active duty, a portion perhaps on leave or whatever, and then a portion in training. And then also that would give you enough for a surge. So one of the problems we saw recently processing refugees from Afghanistan was the difficulty we had in finding the personnel to, enough people to process this. I suspect we're having a similar problem with people with getting visas and stuff for people coming out of Ukraine. So that's a huge problem. It still exists. He accomplished a lot for that. any State Department officer that can remember Colin Powell, if you were to ask them who their favorite Secretary of State was, they would always say General Powell or Secretary Powell. That's a problem. It goes right back to budget. And then certainly public diplomacy, but then also the increasing difficulty we have getting ambassadors confirmed is a real problem. Right now, Ted Cruz is this year has held up almost all ambassador, a few have come through, but held them up simply because of the administration's position on Nord Stream 2. And even though at least in substance, the situation with the pipeline has changed, the positions are still, many of them being held up. So that kind of thing gets worse and worse. We have fewer ambassadors confirmed today than in any previous administration at this time. So those are just a couple of additional thoughts.
Wow. Admiral Johnson, I'm going to pose the same question. We're going to add a little bit of information.
Can I add a couple things to
Yes,
that?
sir, by all means.
I know time is running out already, but first of all, this brings up several things. And the 10% float, of course, within the Department of Defense, we have that built into our manpower numbers. The State Department doesn't. That's an important thing. I also think human capital is important. This brings up the point of universal service, which I'm a strong supporter of, and the talent and the richness of that talent. I think you can make an argument that people who are raising their hand to serve in the armed forces, the numbers of people across the widest possible socioeconomic spectrum of America is changing. People want to go into finance. They want to go, I'm talking about the best and the brightest. So, working in the State Department, working in CIA, civil service, the military and what have you. I think we need to look at that, and we need to incent people. And I think one of the strongest things is universal national service. And I think our country should look at it, although I don't think we have much political support for it now, but I think it would be very important so that everybody has an opportunity to directly work in an area where they're working for something greater than themselves. And there's any number of things that could benefit from that kind of labor. And then you're working with people working. When we had the draft, you had people serving in units in Vietnam across all socioeconomic, racial, and what have you ways, and gaining greater respect for each other rather than in our self-segregating pockets that we live in now. Of course, on the Defense and State Department, I think, certainly going back to Secretary Gates and Secretary Rice, they went up to the Hill together to advocate for the State Department budget. But the fact of the matter is that comes back again to Congress and what have you. In Maine, we have ironworks, and it's very easy to get our congressional delegation excited about funding a shipbuilding budget. But it's very, very difficult to get unanimity in funding the kinds of things that Ambassador White was talking about, USAID, or even within the military budget. Something area that I always, as a commander in Europe, every year they'd ask us for a list. And at the top of my list was always what was called IMET funding, International Military and Education and Training funding. And you bring a family together to the United States, not just the person in the armed forces, but their whole family. You bring it to Newport to the Naval War College, or to Carlisle Barracks to the Army, or to Maxwell Air Force Base, to the Air Force War College. They live in America for a year. They are your friends forever, but we don't fund it nearly enough. It's cheap by far in terms of the rate of return that you get on that investment. And then we do things like sanctions. Take Pakistan, for instance. Many, many years ago, we stopped bringing their people. And now their military is much more radicalized and what have you, not as secular as it used to be. I think Turkey's another example. And so, a lot of this stuff might be penny wise, but it's pound and ton foolish. And so I think, again, we've just got to take a much harder look at all this. The Mandela Scholars Program that lasted for 2 or 3 years. We had that at the University of Maine for 2 summers. Incredible program. And just think what an impact that would be. So, yes, we've got a lot of sponsors for the defense budget, and it is high. But unfortunately, we don't have the advocates for the Department of Defense budget and how important that is. And then this whole concept of public service in America in the broadest spectrum, I think, is something that we need to take a look at.
Can I just make one quick comment to Greg? You reminded me too that increasingly we're in countries where we don't have USAID, so we don't have access to those sorts of programs. It's to the military that we turn. We State Department people turn. If we're doing media literacy or whatever it may be, we work with your civil affairs people. If there are increasingly American presence, which we now generally have in a lot of Eastern Europe, it's to you folks we turn. We couldn't do it without you. And then with the IMET training, I don't know if a lot of people realize this, but the result of that too is not just friendship, but frequently you end up with the chief of defense, somebody who spent a lot of time in the United States. You know,
heads of state.
You know, it happens all the time. So heads of state, everybody. Yeah, and that makes all the difference in the world, literally.
This is certainly a piece that we could go on for the next 45 minutes, but we won't. But thank you very much. And you know, you all referred to the difference in budgets. You know, the numbers are over 700 billion for the Department of Defense budget and barely over 56 billion for the international affairs budget. And I don't know how we change that, but I know that listeners can write their congressional delegations and hopefully in support of the international affairs budget. Just want to remind listeners that if you have a question, please send it in. Those are being assimilated, and we're going to get to that in less than 10 minutes so that we can go ahead and address some of your interests, your areas of focus. But I do want to move ahead just a little bit, and it's on the periphery of what's going on in Ukraine. And so as we watch this terrible war, and Ambassador White, I'm going to go to you first on this. As we watch this terrible war in the Ukraine unfold, have we lost focus, the US or perhaps the West, maybe the world, lost focus and perspective on other crises around the world? You know, for instance, Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan, certainly it was hugely in the news prior, and you'd be hard pressed to find a story on it today, yet it's one of the most incredible unfolding humanitarian crises that's ongoing. Are we losing focus, or how do we? And if we are, how do we remember that there's an awful lot going on in the world that we need to pay attention? Never mind North Korea, so on.
Yeah, I'm so frustrated by it, because all of a sudden, even in my little island down here, there's a fundraiser for Ukraine every other day, and you know, women unite, church members unite, Democrats unite. I'm like, well, yeah, there is a crisis in Ukraine, and I am 1,000% the U.S. Supporting Ukrainians in this fight against Russia, 1,000%. But I do think we've lost our focus on so much of what's going on in the world. Afghanistan is a perfect example. Kids are starving over there. There's a horrific, situation going on in Haiti, that people are being murdered, they're being kidnapped. Half the children have inadequate food. There's South Sudan is a huge problem. Syria, it goes on. And I think that it's not a good thing for us to only focus on one. Although it's huge, I understand that, but what's happening in one part of the world and taking our eyes off the rest of the world, I think it's so unfortunate for the millions of people who are being left behind. And I blame our PR mechanisms in a large part for this, that nothing else seems to matter to the journalists today except going over and showing us the horrific goings on in Ukraine. And there's no, I want to see it and I want to be informed, but I do think that it is very unfortunate and very unfair for the rest of the world that we're not being told just how desperate many people are and the suffering that's going on around the world. I think that many people, started believing that maybe isolationist is a good philosophy for the United States of America, and why don't we just take care of our own and we don't have to reach out around the world. But I think we must have learned the lesson how codependent we are on the world, on the whole, where do we get our supplies from, who is sending people to our workforce here in the United States of America. Our whole immigration problem is another thing that doesn't seem to be discussed right now, but I think is an enormous problem along our southern border and needs immediate attention. I don't think it needs to be a lose-lose situation. I think it can be a win-win situation. We have over 5.5 million jobs in the United States that are going unfilled. Why can't we use our immigration system in order to fill those desperately needed jobs? I don't quite understand it. It seems like it could be a win-win. So I do believe that too much emphasis are being put on the Ukrainian war right now. And this is an aside, but I just read something that said 47% of the people in the United States of America believe we're doing the right thing in Ukraine. 40% of the people do not believe that we're on the right path, but 83% of Russians think Putin is doing the right thing. It kind of shows you just how incredible their PR machine is in Russia. They're a single focused machine, very impressive. No, I don't want to be a Russia, but I think that we do have to respect how they have control over the media. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. The world of information warfare has changed drastically with this conflict, certainly. I'm going to pose the last question, and Ambassador Hall, start with the last question I'll ask, and then we'll go to Q&A. And ma'am, if we could start with you. We have a number of students and young alumni listening today. And I'm hoping that you can address them with a response to this particular question. During last week's Cohen lecture, we heard Secretaries Cohen and Mattis, and I know we've heard each of you talk about how the current generation needs to fix the things that our generation has broken. Do you firmly believe this? And if so, what advice do you have for the younger generation of future ambassadors in Admirals? So that's not only current students. I know there's a lot of SPIA alums that are listening that are, we've only been around for 10 years. And so what would does their generation need to fix what we broke? And if they do, what would your advice be to them? Muted.
Thank you. Certainly there are challenges, and we will look to them to solve those challenges. To me, it seems awfully negative to say that we broke things. I mean, we certainly didn't get it all right. We certainly made some mistakes, but we're not the first generation or in the first moment in history where there were some serious challenges out there. And at the height of the Cold War, I think people were pretty worried when they were building their bomb shelters and practicing going down into those, and nobody was certain how that was going to turn out. Nobody was certain that there wouldn't be nuclear war. And so I guess I'd rather say that there continue to be challenges and we get some things right. And we've not, perhaps not done so well in others. And when I meet the young people today, gosh, I'm incredibly impressed. I'm impressed with their idealism and their unwillingness to settle for the status quo. I think that's really healthy. We've seen it in all sorts of ways in the United States in response to some of the deep-seated social problems we have. So I would say, and certainly going out into the world and working on these issues. So I would just say, stay with it. There are always challenges and it takes our very best. And there has been nothing more. I think most of us who have worked in foreign policy would say there's nothing else they would rather have done. And there's nothing else they would feel more proud of having been a part of in their lives than what they've had the opportunity to do. So I say, do something, get involved in something that's bigger than yourself, get involved in some sort of service and stay the course. And you will help us through whatever turbulent waters we have.
Thank you. Admiral Johnson?
But I'd agree with what Ambassador Hall said. And there are challenges, and no generation completes the to-do list that they have created in their own generation, and that gets passed on. I would just ask everybody to reflect on America and this great experiment that started 246 years ago this July. And I don't think that there's ever been anything like it. And I think that it is worth working with the best and brightest we have in America each and every day to make sure that it continues to succeed and be successful for our country and for all of our citizens, and that it is the best form of government that brings out the full potential to the maximum number of people to the full level of their aspirations than any other society in the world. And that at the end of the day, I would ask them to also think about public service in some way so that they're part of this government and this effort. And it doesn't have to be for all of their life, for their whole profession, because we certainly need people in all of the other sectors, but we also need a great amount of talent. And the one thing, every year I get the opportunity to interview high school students, seniors that are in Maine, seeking admission to our service academies. For one, a member of our CODEL. And I tell you, I am absolutely blown away by the immense talent of these young people, not just their SAT scores and what have you, but their worldview, their sophistication, and the immense number of activities they're involved in, and their strong leadership, their enthusiasm, and their idealism, and how innovative they are. I remember I'm a member of the analog world, and these I could never compete in this world. So it is inspiring, and it gives me a deep sense of confidence in the future of our country when I get to spend time with some of these young people, or SPIA students, or just the students at the University of Maine.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And Ambassador White, same question, and maybe an interesting context for the ambassadors, because I heard you speak to this, is a couple of years ago, it was not, the State Department was not a good place not a place that people were looking to go to. I hope that's changed in the last 13, 14 months. I think it has. You both would know better. So what would your recommendation be to the generation that's listening, and maybe us old timers that can provide advice to that generation, in maybe starting with state?
Yeah, I don't know the current state of recruitment in the State Department. It was certainly down quite a bit. It was very tough to recruit a couple of years ago. I got to look that up because I'm not perfectly sure. But I do know this, that diplomacy around the world has never been needed more, never. We need career, dedicated, passionate diplomats more than we've ever needed them in my lifetime. And I did my best. I used to, when I was first joined Peace Corps, I was sure I was going to change the world. Then I was going to change Africa. Then I was going to change Cameroon. Then I was going to change my village. And it turned out I didn't change any of those things. That changed me. But that's okay. That's what JFK had in mind, I think, when he created the Peace Corps, that we were going to change each other at the human to human level. But diplomacy, the hard work of diplomacy, you're plugging away there every day in the embassy, you're making human contact, you're trying to understand other people so that they understand us and that they respect what the great American values are and how they can live in other countries around the world. This is critically important work, so don't give up. Just it is challenging, and that's what makes it so exciting.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. And I'm now going to turn it over to John Diamond, and hopefully he's got some questions from the audience that he's been able to assimilate and put together. John, over to you.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you all panelists. Great presentation. We've had some really good questions come in as well. Several dealing with the role of diplomacy, looking at it from a much bigger, more of a macro approach. One of the questions asked, how has the nature of American diplomacy changed over the past 30 years, basically since the end of the Cold War? And is it better, worse? Maybe we start with Ambassador Hall and proceed.
Sure. The first change that immediately comes to mind is we work government to government, but we work with much broader segments of society than we did 30 years ago, frankly, for that matter, even 15 years ago. So we really work with a broad range of stakeholders now in diplomacy, members of civil society of all types. And so frequently what our function is is to actually bring together sometimes elements of host country government with civil society to try to move policies forward. And I think I would say in my career, that's one of the greatest changes. And the other is the degree, and this is coming out of our experience really starting in Afghanistan and then in Iraq, but the degree to which State Department and the Pentagon work together, and how much better we understand each other now, I think, than we did before we went into those into those wars. And I think that that's been to the benefit, I think, probably of both institutions. I think we work very well overseas together. Softly, and certainly in my experience, it's just been tremendously enriching to work with my Department of Defense colleagues overseas. So those are the two areas I would mention that, you know, that we haven't touched on previously.
Thank you. Ambassador White?
Yeah, I think one thing that we do much less well over the last 30 years is public diplomacy. Although we have staffs in the embassy and they work very hard at it, I just don't think they have the tools necessary, nor the skills necessary, and we really got to get that back. So that's my big cheerleading speech. But I also think something that's changed dramatically in the developing world over the last 20, 25 years for the better, especially over the last 15, 20, I think, is the inclusion of the private sector in what we do around the world. And we very seldomly engage with the private sector, but now we have lots of public-private agreements with Coca-Cola, with, I mean, Nike, all over the world, so that we can work together to improve countries and how they function and help get people out of poverty. I think that this has been an excellent improvement about how we go about looking at what development really is and how we can use economic growth in order to bring people out of poverty. So these partnerships have been invaluable.
Thank you. I believe you're muted.
Yeah.
There you go. Thank you.
I'd like to add that one of the big, I think, challenges that our nation has faced in this area since the end of the Cold War is an overarching strategy. From the end of Cold War until into the early 90s, we had the containment strategy, and it was coherent. People could understand it. It was simple. It was one word, and it carried over from administration to administration from essentially 1945, like I said, till the mid. And so even though there were variations, it was always on this theme of containment. And so you went from a Democrat to a Republican to a Democratic administration, but there was coherence in this strategy, for better or worse. And sometimes it was more gracefully and elegantly done and effectively done, sometimes not so much, but still we had this overarching. We've had a great difficulty coming up with an overarching strategic strategy, geostrategic strategy for going forward that would be coherent and go from administration to administration. I think one of the good things that may have happened in the Obama administration was working on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. I think one of the most important geostrategic efforts underway. And on the first day of the next administration, we were pulled out of it. Huge, from a geostrategic standpoint, as far as I'm concerned, mistake. Yeah, there are some trade issues involved that were important, but it's nothing compared to the geostrategic importance, because by that one simple little fact, you required every single nation on the Pacific Rim to now bring China much more to the forefront of their risk calculations and how they were going to go forward. And then if it's going to change the next time there's a change in administration, this creates great turmoil in our allies and our wannabe allies and those who want to be allies with us and have factions in their countries that are opposed to that. So I think that this is a huge problem for us. It's a very difficult problem. Any number of people have tried to get together, State Department, Defense Department, what have you, and come up with a coherent, overarching strategy, kind of like built around globalization. And now that's kind of out of vogue. But the fact of the matter is, our economy is totally dependent upon free access to the markets of the world. So there has to be some kind, and that's ultimately where our power comes from. It isn't from the State Department or from the military, what have you, our overarching power that undergirds everything about America is our economic power. So there perhaps is a way some bright students in SPIA or some other school of foreign policy or what have you are going to be able to come up with this strategy. But I think that that is very important going forward in this. That's a part of what this question that you asked, Jim.
Greg, can I just add something? What you've just said goes to the heart of the challenges that certainly I faced as ambassador, but it goes to our credibility and our word. And we spend a lot of time asking countries to help us accomplish goals. Most recently, of course, we did things like pull out of TPP, and then over the last few years, question the need for NATO, really. And that was deeply unsettling. All of those things our allies, our friends see, and they worry on, it's just deeply unsettling, and it makes it that much more difficult for us than the next time that we want to go to our friends and our allies and ask for help. Makes it that much more difficult for them to decide to stand up and frequently do some things that are difficult. Could be passing a budget, who knows, whatever, but do some difficult things in order to help us. It makes it that much more difficult, and it makes it also that much easier for countries like China, which are pretty consistent with what they're doing, to get the attention that they want.
Thank you. Following up on that, there is, and this goes back to something that all three of you touched on early on in your opening remarks, and this pertains to the influence of domestic issues, and including economic, but also social issues and political issues, their influence here at home, and how that pertains to the United States' ability to address what's happening in Eastern Europe and in other parts of the world. How much of an issue is that for people who are working from a diplomatic standpoint in trying to advance the interests of the United States?
Well, I don't know what exactly the questioner meant by domestic issues, but I can surmise it has to do with things like racial issues, police violence, gun violence, January 6th, all of those kinds of issues. And they all make a huge difference. At the end of the day, a diplomat, this might sound crass, I don't mean it to sound, but they're selling America. That's what their job is. That's what diplomacy is. And that you want to hitch your wagon with our wagon. And in the long run, that'll be better for your country. It'll be better for our country. And it'll be better for mankind throughout the world. And so in order to do that, you got to have a product that, is quite attractive. And I think we do have a product that's quite attractive. And it's been a work in progress for 246 years. It still has some way to go. But I'm very proud of America. I'm very proud to be an American. And so I'm deeply distressed when I see things like one of the worst days of my life, sort of like 9/11 was January 6th. The whole thing that I thought I was in the armed forces doing, creating an environment for democracy and freedom to flourish in the world, and we challenge it here. That's profoundly disconcerting. And so it's kind of hard to sell our product and ask people to hitch their wagon with us. So we need to pay attention to that and think of it in that context, because at the end of the day, the better we do at this diplomacy game, the more allies we have, the more friends we have, the stronger our economy will be, the better salaries everybody will have, the more America will flourish, and everybody else will. It's a tide that will lift all boats. And so I think that the trend now to more insularity is fraught with danger, and it's a path that we don't want to go down.
Thank you. Ambassador.
Yes, I think please. In particular, just a quick one, I think in particular, the gun violence in our country has just had enormous negative made the United States of America not look good in the eyes of many countries around the world, and makes our ability to spread the word about what a great and fabulous country the United States of America is, much more difficult. Whether it's January 6th, but it's just the constant killing of our young people and our minorities is a horrific image to see around the world, and you do see it around the world.
Ambassador, just to follow up on that, you had said earlier that the United States, or maybe you were meaning the public, has lost our focus on what's going on in the world. Do you think that the public believes we have the resources and provides the public support that's necessary from your perspectives as diplomats? Do we have the resources and public support to address the humanitarian and diplomatic roles, the historic roles that the United States has played, as well as the needs the United States has to maintain its diplomatic relations around the world?
I truly do not believe we have enough resources. I think we need a doubling of our diplomatic budgets and a quadrupling of our public relations budget, which is very small. But I do also think that we have made tremendous strides in the developing world. The number of lives we've saved because of our interventions in HIV/AIDS and malaria, maternal mortality, the help that we've given a country like Haiti that had a horrific cholera outbreak just 8 years ago. This year they're reporting no cholera cases whatsoever. I mean, these successes no one knows about. No one hears about them. We're horrible about doing our own PR about all the great things we're doing around the world. And one of the things that the old USIA did under, numerous administrations actually, was tell the United States of America about the great things that we were doing here and there around the world. So it was also a PR machine for our own people. And we almost never do that. When's the last time you saw a really feel-good story about the great United States and what we're accomplishing overseas? Like, never. It's ridiculous.
Ambassador Hall?
Yeah, we've never done a very good job linking our efforts overseas to perhaps prosperity at home. And it's something that we keep trying to do, but it's not something that we do well enough, I think. Europe is still the United States' largest trading and investment partner. I think in terms of just raw trade, China surpassed it last year, but in terms of trade, services, goods and services, investment, it's still Europe. And helping to create transparent, stable economies abroad are helpful to us and important to us in so many ways for our business and for certainly in terms of migration flows. There's of course all the issues of climate that have been part of the our national security. What do we call it? What is it, the annual national, now I can't remember, Grog knows what it's called, but our Defense Department has been studying the dangers of, climate and for years. And so I don't think we have ever done a very good job of connecting what we do overseas to in ways that it matters here at home. But so I think that's certainly a challenge. And the other thing I would say, going back to public diplomacy, is that in the parts of the world where I've served, the Russians have a lot of free television. They have channels directed to the Baltics that are specially, they're for the Baltics. China's increasingly getting into that game, but for us, we just have, CNN or whatever, and people can't see that unless they can afford cable. And so we have Radio Free Europe, which is, we've slowly been able to increase the access into the kind of the Russian world. But that's a challenge. Again, there's limited funding. So we've never been able to crack that. Not yet anyway, have we been able to crack that challenge of countering those very powerful propaganda machines.
We have a question here about the CIA and how beneficial is the CIA to the work of diplomats?
Want me to take that one?
Sure.
Very very. All I can say. I mean, absolutely. Absolutely.
I would totally agree. And again, coming back to, you know, when I traveled as a commander, NATO commander and head of naval forces, we would always meet with the country team, and part of the country team, of course, was the chief of station. And it's critical for our diplomacy and to inform our diplomacy, to inform the military. And it's very difficult work now. And, you know, not to get into too many details, but HUMENT is incredibly important. And that's becoming nearly impossible, very, very difficult. But the eyes and the ears of everybody that works in the mission overseas lends to that. And we're getting, there are other ways we can get a lot of it. And now with artificial intelligence and the massive information that we collect just from white, you know, we call it white. Just if we, because people want to tell you what they're doing, even in autocratic governments, they want to tell you about how smart they are and all the wonderful things they're doing. We just have to harvest it. So that we're getting a lot better at it, but still just being on the ground and understanding the culture of the people and what they're thinking. So it's very, very important. And I think that it's a very good investment, and we want to continue to support it as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's incredibly important. My day always started with a briefing by the CIA officer. They're outside the embassy. They have, you know, feet right on the soil of the ground. They're, like I have told many of my officers, that they're inside the embassy building, you're probably not doing your job. And the CIA people are almost never inside the building, and they are doing their job, and they're protecting our great country, for sure.
One of the questions that we had submitted deals with the influence or impact of what's happening now with Russia's invasion of Ukraine on how China is going to behave toward Taiwan. Can you folks address that? Share your opinions on that.
Well, it's a good question, and I think we're all watching, and I think China will be informed by what happens in Ukraine. I think in some ways, although it's, I find it personally distressing. I call it, you know, Ukraine is the product of 20 years of fecklessness by the West and other NATO, EU, United States, and other like-minded nations and institutions. But given that it's happened, and we finally took some calcium pills, I guess, and started to get a little bit more backbone and starting to respond, because sanctions are not going to deter Mr. Putin. It's going to take much more than sanctions. And so I do think the fact that we have now come together and seem to be forming a coherent network of support for Ukraine. We're still a little slow, but we're making progress in that. I think that that actually has given, may well have given China pause to think about, do they really want to do that in Taiwan? And I have every reason to believe that the Taiwanese would fight back with the level of passion for their country as Ukraine has. And that means that, you know, if they're really going to take it over, it's going to be an all-out brutal battle, siege warfare from the medieval times, encircle them and then pound them into rubble, which is the Russian way. China might have to resort to that. I don't know. We'll have to see if they really think that's something they want to do. So I think in some ways, it may actually slow them down a little bit. And they'll just, but they like to say that, you know, we have the watches, they have the time, and they work on a different clock than we do. And let's hope they continue to work on a different clock that extends far, far out into the future.
But I do think people are watching what the heck we're doing in Ukraine. And I admit that, I guess calcium's one way of putting it. That wouldn't be my way of putting it if I were sitting in a room with you guys. But you know, I think we've dragged our feet here a bit. And I don't like the image of the United States not coming out full force with everything we've got to support the Ukrainian people. I think sanctions are fine, and I think to a certain degree they do work, but I do not believe that that is going to frighten Putin into any kind of submission of stopping this horrendous invasion of Ukraine. So the world is watching, China is watching. We were hoping, my great friend, Linda Thomas Greenfield, the US ambassador to the UN, was hoping very much that China might abstain in the vote about Russia, kicking Russia out of the Human Rights Council. They did not. They voted with Russia. And I think that that goes to show that there's a dance going on with Russia and China that's dangerous. We need to maintain positive relationships with China. I do believe they're watching just how tough we are. And I think we're getting tougher, but I think we need to be tougher still with our support to Ukraine. A tough one.
I agree that, it's taken us longer to get some of the heavier equipment, heavier weaponry into Ukraine than perhaps I think a lot of us would have liked to have seen. But having spent the last 3 years in Lithuania, where Germany leads the NATO battle group there, I'm also aware that there's been a lot of concern over the years about Germany, the need for Bundestag approval for certain things that some of the other NATO allies wouldn't need. And I think that it was critically important that this administration, at least in the early, knit together real allied unity, because I don't believe that was there in the beginning. There were, it's shades, I'm not saying, but there were shades. And I think if we had failed to do that, then I think we'd be in a very different place today. And that's, of course, what Putin was hoping for and expecting. And so I think that the work that this administration did initially was probably extremely important. I mean, you can't prove a negative. We don't know what it would have been like had they not achieved that, but I think it was very important. And then, but I'm very glad to see that we're doing more. I think it's also always very slow for democracies to really believe or somehow grapple with an opponent that really only respects raw power. And that's something that our Eastern European friends still have a memory of. It's something that they have a much easier time understanding, but I think it tends to take the older Western democracies a little longer to accept that and really deal with it. And hopefully we're getting there. I mean, because I agree, sanctions, I think they'll have a long-term effect. And I really think there's a possibility that, at some point, I don't know when, a few years, whatever, but we could be looking at how to handle a collapse of the Russian government. I kind of hope that's what we're looking at eventually, but I think that at this point we've got to just break the back of the Russian offensive, and hopefully we're getting to the point where that will be possible.
Very good. Well, a sobering note to end on, and I do want to thank all of you, Ambassador Hall, Ambassador White, and Admiral Johnson, as well as Captain Settley, for this presentation today. We appreciate your time and your perspective, and we're grateful that that you shared it with us, and we're also grateful that you are Black Bear alumni. It's a wonderful showcase of what our university alumni can do. So I do, in addition to our panelists and moderator, I do want to thank Aisha Veer of the Alumni Association, who managed all the logistics and technical aspects of today's webinar today, as she does all the time. And also thanks to all of you for taking part and taking the time to be part of this presentation. As I mentioned at the beginning, it will be posted on the Alumni Association's YouTube channel. We will send out a link to you, everybody who registered for this session today, so that you can access it. And of course, we encourage you to share it with others. We do have one more webinar coming up on a very different topic, lighter and perhaps, and that is on May 5th, when we are having a presentation by retired UMaine professor Kathy Olmsted, also an accomplished author and publisher, who's going to be talking about Aroostook County. She'll be talking about her book called True North. It's stories and essays about the people and lifestyle of Aroostook County, something very special to all Mainers, no matter where you grew up or whether you've even visited there. But that again is on May 5th, and all of you who registered for today will get an invitation to that event as well. So on behalf of our panel and our moderator and on behalf of the Alumni Association, thank you all so much. Wish you a great day and a great weekend, holiday weekend and week coming up. Take care now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go Black Bears.
Right.
Go Black Bears.
Your last 2.5 months.
Thank you.